The sun was sinking low over the Wyoming plains, throwing streaks of orange and gold across the horizon, the kind of light that made the land look endless and lonely all at once, and in that fading glow, a dusty carriage rolled toward the worn wooden gate of the McAllister Ranch, where life had a rhythm of its own. Sunrise, hard work, and the slow quiet of evening that held stories too heavy for words. Inside that carriage sat a woman named Clara Bennett, hands clasped tight in her lap, the leather gloves she wore hiding the faint tremor that came whenever she faced a new beginning. She was 32, with auburn hair pinned neatly beneath her traveling hat, eyes the color of the river at dusk, calm on the surface, but deep enough to drown a man's doubts. She had answered an ad that most women wouldn't have looked at twice, a widowed rancher with 3 young children seeking help on the ranch, and maybe more, if God wills. That, maybe more, had stayed in Clara's mind longer than it should have, because it stirred something she thought she'd buried long ago, the hope of belonging somewhere again. But she wasn't here for love, she told herself that a dozen times as the carriage rattled up the long road. She was here for work, a roof, and a chance to start over after losing nearly everything. When the driver finally stopped at the gate, she stepped out, her boots hitting the dry earth, the air thick with the scent of hay and dust and something faintly sweet, like wildflowers after rain. "You must be Miss Bennett," came a deep voice from the barn, and she turned to see him. The man in the shadows was tall, broad-shouldered, his shirt rolled to his elbows, arms streaked with dust and muscle, his hair the color of wheat, his eyes a steady blue that caught the dying light like glass catching flame. "Clara Bennett," she said, offering her hand, trying to steady her voice, and he took it gently, his calloused fingers warm, the kind of warmth that comes from a life spent outdoors. "Jonah McAllister," he said simply, and smiled, a smile that didn't need to try, one that could have made the wind itself pause to listen. There was a long, unspoken silence then, the kind that only the West can hold, where every glance carries the weight of a story untold. He nodded toward the house. "You've had a long ride. Let's get you settled." As she followed him up the path, she caught sight of 3 small figures on the porch, 2 boys and a little girl, no older than 6, all peeking out from behind the railings. The smallest, the girl, had the same blue eyes as her father and a streak of mischief that showed in her grin. "They're mine," Jonah said softly, as if reading Clara's thought. "Their mama passed 3 winters ago." Clara felt her heart sink and swell all at once. She knew loss, deep and raw, and for a moment she wanted to reach out, to say something comforting, but the words stayed trapped behind her polite smile. Inside the house, the walls were lined with memories, photographs, old saddles, a shelf with worn books and a single rocking chair that still swayed slightly, like a ghost of movement. Jonah showed her to a room upstairs, modest but clean, and said, "You'll be helping with the house, the kids, and whatever else needs doing. The pay's fair, and meals are with the family. You good with that?" She nodded. "Yes, Mr. McAllister." He paused, his gaze steady. "Jonah's fine." There was something disarming about the way he said her name later that night, at supper, when the children laughed and the fire crackled low. He didn't pry, didn't ask about her past, though she could tell he sensed the weight she carried. Over the next weeks, the rhythm of ranch life became her anchor, the early mornings, the smell of coffee and bacon, the thud of boots on the porch, and the endless stretch of sky that made her feel both small and free. She grew close to the children, especially little Ellie, who followed her everywhere, tugging at her skirts and asking questions that never seemed to end. "Are you gonna marry Papa?" the girl asked one morning, startling her so much she nearly dropped the bucket she was carrying. "What? No, sweetheart," Clara laughed nervously. "I'm just helping out." Ellie frowned. "Papa smiles more when you're here." Clara didn't know what to say to that. Jonah was kind, patient, and strong in the quiet way men of the land are, steady as an oak. He listened when she spoke, respected her space, and never pushed. But there was something in his eyes that made her heart ache, a mixture of loneliness and hope, like he wanted to reach out but didn't know if she'd let him. And yet, for all the warmth of those days, Clara's nights were filled with old fears. She would wake from dreams of the life she'd lost, the husband who'd loved her once, the home that burned down one cruel winter night, the doctor's words that had broken her spirit, "You'll never be able to have children, Miss Bennett." "I'm sorry." That sentence had carved a scar deeper than fire ever could. So she'd built walls around her heart, told herself she'd never burden anyone with her brokenness again. But as the months passed, those walls began to crack beneath Jonah's quiet strength and the children's laughter. One evening, a storm rolled over the plains, thunder echoing across the hills. The kids were huddled inside, wide-eyed, while Jonah fought to secure the horses. Clara couldn't just stand by. She ran out into the rain, skirts whipping around her legs, shouting to be heard over the wind. Together they dragged hay bales, fastened gates, and by the time it was done, they were soaked through, laughing breathlessly under the barn roof. Jonah looked at her then, not as an employer, not even as a friend, but as someone who'd been missing from his life far too long. You didn't have to do that, he said, voice low, rain dripping from his hat brim. I couldn't let you face it alone, she replied. That night, after the storm, something changed. He walked her back to the porch, and before she stepped inside, he caught her hand gently. Clara, he began, you don't have to tell me your story, but I hope someday you will. You've brought light back into this house, into my kids' lives, into mine. She didn't trust her voice, so she just nodded, her heart thundering louder than the storm had. The days turned into weeks again, softer now, easier somehow. The ranch seemed brighter, the laughter louder. But fate has a way of testing fragile peace. One afternoon, a woman from town came by, a gossipy type with too much rouge and too little kindness. You know, she said in a whisper Clara couldn't ignore, folks say you're aiming to be the next Mrs. McAllister. Poor man deserves a real wife, one who can give him children. The words struck like a knife. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She stood at the window, watching the stars blur through tears. The next morning, she packed her small trunk. Jonah found her by the carriage, heart sinking as he saw her ready to leave. Clara, what's going on? He asked, his voice rough. She turned away, unable to meet his eyes. I can't stay, Jonah. I should never have come. If it's about the gossip, forget it. People will talk. It's not that, she cut in, her voice trembling. It's me. You deserve someone who can give you everything, someone whole. He stepped closer, confusion giving way to concern. What are you talking about? She finally looked at him then, tears spilling freely. I can't have children, Jonah. The doctor told me years ago. I thought I could live with it, but I can't let you or your kids get attached to someone who'll never. Her voice broke. For a long moment, the air between them was silent but heavy. Jonah stared at her, then slowly reached out, taking her hands in his rough, steady grip. Good, he said softly, a faint, warm smile touching his lips. Because I've already got enough kids for both of us. The simplicity of it shattered her. Tears blurred her vision as he pulled her close, his voice barely above a whisper. Clara, I don't need more children. I just need you. You've given us more life than I ever thought this place would see again. You made this ranch feel like home. She sobbed into his chest, the years of loneliness melting away in that embrace, and for the first time in a long time, she felt like she belonged somewhere, like maybe God hadn't forgotten her after all. The children ran out then, hugging them both, laughter ringing through the air like music. And as the evening light washed over the ranch, Clara looked up at Jonah, her voice trembling but sure. Maybe it's time I stopped running. He smiled that quiet cowboy smile, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Reckon it is. The wind carried the scent of sage and rain, the land bathed in gold once more, and as the McAllister ranch settled into another night, the stars above seemed to shine just a little brighter, as if they knew two broken souls had finally found their way home. The morning after Clara's confession felt different, as if the entire ranch had exhaled a long-held breath. The sky was pale gold, the kind of color that promised peace after a storm, and for the first time in years, Jonah McAllister woke with something like hope instead of heaviness in his chest. He found Clara already in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, hair loose from its pins, humming softly as she kneaded bread. The children were still asleep upstairs, and the quiet between them was warm, easy, filled with the kind of understanding that needed no words. Didn't think you'd still be here, he said gently, leaning against the doorway, and she looked up, a faint smile touching her lips. You gave me a reason to stay, she replied, her voice soft but steady. From that morning on, life on the McAllister ranch began to shift in ways both small and mighty. The laughter came back stronger, the suppers longer, the nights quieter, not from loneliness but from contentment. Clara became the heartbeat of the home, her hands healing the children's scrapes, her laughter echoing in the barn, her presence turning every shadow into light. Jonah, who had once buried his feelings beneath the weight of work, found himself watching her when she wasn't looking, memorizing the way she tilted her head when she thought, or how her eyes softened when Ellie climbed into her lap. He had known hardship, losing his wife, raising 3 young children alone, fighting against drought and debt, but he had never known peace like this. Still, beneath all the joy, there was a quiet fear in Clara's heart. She had been loved before, but never without condition. Could Jonah truly love her without the promise of more children, without the legacy most men in the West yearned for? One evening, while the sunset burned red over the pastures, she found him fixing a fence by the river. The kids were playing nearby, their laughter rising like music over the rush of water. Jonah, she began, hesitant, do you ever wish for more? He paused, resting his arm on the post, and turned toward her. More. He echoed. You mean land? Cattle? No, she said quietly. Children. He studied her for a long moment, then smiled that slow, steady smile she'd come to know so well. Clara, I don't need a bigger family. I just need a full heart. You've given me that. The simplicity of his answer broke her walls again, and in that moment she understood what love truly meant. It wasn't measured by blood or lineage, but by presence, by faith, by choosing someone every single day even when the world said you shouldn't. As spring turned to summer, the ranch flourished. Jonah and Clara worked side by side from dawn till dusk, rebuilding fences, tending fields, and teaching the children lessons not found in any book. She taught them kindness, patience, and hope. He taught them strength, responsibility, and respect. Together, they built something far more precious than wealth. They built a home bound by love. Yet, like all good stories, peace was tested. One blistering afternoon, word came from town that the bank was foreclosing on several ranches in the valley, including Jonah's if he couldn't make his payment by the end of the month. Years of drought had taken their toll, and though he tried to hide it, Clara saw the worry etched into his face. She wanted to help, to do something, anything, but he refused her offer of money from the small inheritance she'd brought. I won't let you carry my burden, he said firmly. But that night, when he fell asleep at the table, exhaustion heavy on his shoulders, she sat beside him, tracing the lines of his hand, and whispered, we're in this together now, Jonah McAllister. Whether you like it or not. The next morning, she rode into town alone. There, she met with the general store owner and offered to teach the town's children in exchange for supplies, using the one gift she still had from her old life, her education. Soon, Clara's tiny classroom in the church hall became a haven of laughter and learning, and though she returned home bone-tired each night, she carried with her enough earnings to help pay the bank in time. When Jonah found out what she'd done, he didn't scold her, he just pulled her close, his voice thick with emotion. You saved this ranch, he said. No, she whispered. We did. The following weeks were filled with celebration, hard work, and gratitude. The children surprised them one evening by hanging wildflowers over the porch and setting a small table with their mismatched dishes. What's all this? Jonah asked, smiling. A wedding, Ellie shouted. You already love each other, so we decided you should get married. Clara laughed through tears as Jonah knelt beside the little girl. You think your papa needs to make it official, huh? Yes, Ellie said proudly. So you'll never leave again. Jonah looked up at Clara then, his expression soft but sure. Guess I better listen to my daughter. The wedding was simple, under the cottonwood tree by the river where the sunset painted the water gold. The preacher from town came, and half the valley showed up with pies and flowers. Clara wore a dress she'd sewn herself, and Jonah wore his best hat, his hands shaking as he held hers. When the preacher asked if he took this woman as his wife, Jonah smiled and said, Reckon I've been hers a long time already. Laughter rippled through the crowd, but Clara was crying, her heart too full to hold back. And do you, Miss Bennett, take this man? The preacher asked. With all that I am, she whispered. The cheers that followed seemed to echo clear across the valley. That night, under a blanket of stars, they danced barefoot on the grass while the children chased fireflies around them. It wasn't the kind of love story found in fancy novels, it was raw, real, built on heartbreak and healing, the kind that lasts because it's been tested by fire. Weeks turned into months again, and life settled into a rhythm sweeter than before. But then, one cold autumn morning, Clara woke with a strange stillness inside her. She'd been feeling unwell for days, dizzy and faint, but brushed it off as exhaustion. Jonah insisted on calling the doctor from town, and when he arrived, the air in the room seemed to hold its breath. After a long examination, the doctor smiled gently. "Mrs. McAllister," he said, "you're going to have a baby." The words didn't register at first. Clara just stared, disbelieving. "That's not possible," she whispered. "The doctors before, well," he interrupted kindly, "they were wrong." When Jonah heard, he didn't speak, he just dropped to his knees beside her, tears in his eyes, his hands trembling as he cupped her face. "Miracles happen, Clara," he said, his voice breaking. "And I reckon you were mine long before this." The months that followed were filled with laughter, nerves, and prayers whispered into the night. The children fussed over her endlessly, and Jonah refused to let her lift a thing heavier than a book. When the day finally came, the entire ranch seemed to hold its breath again. After hours of labor, the sound of a newborn's cry filled the house, strong and pure. It was a girl, tiny and perfect, with her father's blue eyes and her mother's auburn hair. Jonah held her close, his tears falling freely as he looked at Clara, pale but smiling. "We'll name her Grace," he said softly. "Because that's what brought her here." And Clara, exhausted but glowing, nodded through tears. "Grace," she whispered. "Our little miracle." Years later, when the ranch had grown and the children had too, Jonah would often sit on the porch in the quiet of evening, watching Clara and their children laugh in the fading light, his heart full to bursting. Sometimes he'd think back to that first day she arrived, so unsure, so afraid, and he'd smile at how life has a way of mending what seems forever broken. And on those nights, when the stars shone bright and the wind carried the sound of laughter through the open plains, he'd whisper to himself, "Good, I've got enough love for all of us."